All right, why don't we begin? I'm Joel Trachtman, Professor of International Law at the Fletcher School, and I'm delighted on behalf of the Center on International Law and Governance and the Law Program at Fletcher to welcome you and to introduce my colleague, Jeswald Salacus, Dean Emeritus and Professor Emeritus and mentor to many of us who will be the MC and host of these proceedings. Jess?
Thank you, Joel. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry that Dean Rachel Kite could not be here because of a family emergency, but was glad to be able to help out. If you look at the last 4 years, Donald Trump has affected massive changes in the relations of the United States with the world. In fact, it reminds me a little bit of a wrecking ball with the debris being scattered around as a result. We see that he removed us from the Paris Accord on climate change in 2015. He rejected the agreement negotiated with the European powers to impose some limits on Iran's nuclear program. He withdrew us from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and it goes on and on and on. I think if you look at what has happened, and I think my colleagues will be talking to you about that, the approach of the Trump administration has been one of dealing with the rest of the world in an extreme transactional way. It is a set of policies that show skepticism and, in fact, I'd say outright hostility to multilateral arrangements and institutions. And there is sometimes not only neglect, but enthusiastic dismissal of established international norms and standards. So as we look around, we see great damage, I think, that's been done to the international system and particularly our relations and our loss. I think with the arrival of President Joseph Biden, he's seen the wreckage, and I think he's promised to do something about it. In his inaugural address, he made, I think, a key statement. He said, "We will repair our alliances and engage with the world once again." So by that statement, it seems that the Biden administration was setting forth a dual set of objectives: repair and re-engagement, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, because all of this raises an important question. And the topic of our seminar this morning is international law in the Biden administration expectations. So what? One of the things I think we can ask, there's some first of all, when you look at that title, particularly the word expectations, there's a certain amount of ambiguity. I mean, there are two kind of connotations of expectation. One is a firm belief that something will happen. It's predictive and probability based, and the other is a statement that something should happen, as another meaning of expectations. And finally, there's a further question: is whose expectations are we talking about? Expectations are usually belong to a particular group, particular individual, and the statement and title of this program doesn't really give us much indication, and I'm sure the panel will try to struggle with that. So to explore this question, the question of what expectations for the Biden administration in the area of international law and relations, the Joel Center has brought together, I think, a stellar panel of international experts, international legal experts from the Fletcher School. And I think they all have impressive resumes. They have lengthy biographies and rich experience. But for the shortness of time, I'm simply going to introduce them very briefly, and so to allow us to go on to some of the substance of the program. First, Antonia Chayes is professor of practice of international politics and law. She specializes in international security, dispute settlement, and treaty practice. She's also served as Undersecretary of the U.S. Air Force during the Carter administration. Next is Tom Dannenbaum, who's assistant professor of international law. He specializes in human rights, the law of war. He's published widely, and his recent book, The Crime of Aggression, Humanity and the Soldier, was published by Cambridge University Press. Third is Michael Glennon, who is a well-published, experienced expert and recognized expert in the field of public international law and the United States Constitution and the relations between those two areas. Before coming to Fletcher, Mike was the legal counsel of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee, and there he got to know and work with then Senator Joe Biden. Ian Johnstone is professor of international law, specializing in international organizations, peacekeeping, and humanitarian affairs. Before his arrival at the Fletcher School, he was a legal and political officer in the Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Among other things that we've kept him busy is that he served as academic dean and dean ad interim. And finally, our convener, Joel Trachtman, is a professor of international law also, but specializing in, particularly in the area of trade and economic law. Before coming to the Fletcher School, he practiced law with a distinguished international firm. He also has served as our academic dean and dean ad interim. Before we ask each member of the panel to look at his or her specialty and how, what expectations we can have as to how the Biden administration will affect that, that specialty. I'd like to probe a question because I do think it helps inform expectations. What is it that we can take from, what is it about Joe Biden's background, experience, and attitudes on international law that may affect the process of re-engagement and repair that he hopes to undertake? And I want to ask Mike Glennon, because he has worked with Joe Biden when he was in the Senate, to give us his thoughts about what do we need to know about Biden's attitudes and experience with international law that might help us to make better predictions about the efforts of the Biden administration to repair and re-engage the United States international relations. Mike?
Jess, first of all, thank you for coming back to join us. We've missed you. We didn't have a chance to celebrate Jess's career in the style that it warranted because he very quietly retired this summer without giving us a chance to do that. We couldn't have done it anyway, but I hope that once this terrible virus lifts, we can do it in the style that it deserves. Thanks for being with us, Jess. It's an honor to be asked to say a few words about the years that I worked with President Biden when he was the newest and youngest member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He came in 1973. I began working with the committee in 1973 as well. The senators who served on the committee in those years were towering giants in American politics: Fulbright, Church, Javits, McGovern, Humphrey, Lugar. There were no red senators or blue senators in those days. In committee hearings, you really couldn't tell who was a Democrat and who was a Republican. Its members were unfailingly polite to one another, and they forged bonds of mutual respect and often friendship in the turmoil of the final months of the Vietnam War. And the excruciating decisions that they were often called upon to make in the process of trying to extricate ourselves from that horrible, horrible war. One of my earliest recollections of Biden comes from what was maybe the most difficult day that the committee faced. It was in April of 1975, and I remember it vividly. The committee's two staff investigators, Dick Moose and Chuck Meisner, had just returned from an urgent mission to Saigon. They returned early from Saigon, and the committee convened immediately in executive session to hear what they had learned. Everybody was there. Moose had very alarming news. The North Vietnamese army was advancing on Saigon much faster than had been expected. The American embassy staff was at risk. Thousands of Vietnamese who had sided with the United States during the war faced abandonment and probably bloody death. And the American ambassador was in an apparent state of denial about the unfolding calamity and refused to initiate the evacuation plan. Moose concluded his briefing, and you could have heard a pin drop. It seemed like an eternity. And I remember at that moment glancing across the table and seeing the strain on Joe Biden's face. Biden, I think, knew, as everybody in that room did, that the committee would soon have to make a decision whether to authorize a potential re-entry into the Vietnam War to save those people that was going to cost lives, possibly lots and lots of lives, whichever option was chosen. I think Biden genuinely felt for those people and for their families. The political philosophy that Biden has said to have espoused over the coming years has been called liberal internationalism. I suppose that's accurate. But to me, it's come down ever since that day to something that's been a lot more basic: simple empathy. Let me give you a few quick examples of what I'm talking about. And there are also examples, by the way, when Biden stood up for some very important constitutional principles in the face of considerable opposition. In 1977, the SALT I interim agreement faced expiration, which would have basically left an arms race unregulated between the United States and the Soviet Union. President Carter continued it with a policy declaration which was very strongly opposed, probably by a majority of the Senate, led by the Washington State hawk, Henry Jackson. Biden supported the administration in the face of that very strong opposition. 1979, President Carter recognized the People's Republic of China and terminated the Mutual Security Treaty with Taiwan, the Republic of China. Again, I think a majority of the Senate probably opposed what President Carter did. Biden supported the administration in the face of that very powerful opposition led by Barry Goldwater and Harry Byrd of Virginia. 1987, the Reagan administration tried to reinterpret the ABM treaty to permit the building, testing, deployment of this so-called Strategic Defense Initiative, laser-based anti-missile systems in outer space. Senator Biden argued that that was a violation of the ABM treaty and indeed an affront to the Senate because it flouted the meaning that was conveyed to the Senate at the time the ABM treaty was approved. Biden prevailed. He led the fight against Star Wars, and his condition that I just described was included in a resolution adopted by the Senate and a condition of the INF treaty. A year later, he chaired the Senate Special Subcommittee on War Powers, for which I had the privilege of serving as special counsel at his invitation. And its hearings, as a result, recommended a comprehensive revision of the War Powers Resolution. And in addition, something else that's been overlooked by everybody who's, I think, been looking back at Biden's career. And it is, in my view, one of the most creative and boldest proposals made by any senator during this period. In 1992, Biden proposed revivifying the United Nations Security Council by initiating the negotiation of special agreements with the Council under Article 43, under which the United States and other nations would provide standing units of the military for the Security Council to resolve international disputes. Biden estimated that 3,000 to 8,000 American troops would be made available under the direction of the Military Staff Committee of the Security Council. This is really an incredible proposal for any senator to make. And as I say, it's been largely overlooked. My own sense is that the window of opportunity has closed now, unfortunately, for these grand and noble ideas. The world is obviously a very different place today than the world of 40 years ago. No one can know, however, how deeply liberal internationalism still beats in Joe Biden's heart. My sense is, from what he said and from what appointments he's made, that he has not forgotten those formative events of his early Senate career and the culture of civility that prevailed in the face of deadly crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Others of you who've had perceptions of or dealt with Biden, I don't know whether you have anything you want to add or comments as well on the appointments that he's been making to build a team to work on the process of repair and re-engagement. Okay, let's move on then to look to your own particular expertise, areas of expertise. So I'm going to ask each member of the panel to take not more than 5 minutes to lay out what you think the specific actions that the Biden administration needs to take in their particular area of specialization. For those participating in this meeting who have questions for the panel or in general, please use your question and A function, and we will try to select those particular questions at the appropriate times that might be dealt with by the panelists. So let me start out with Tony Chayes, and to address this question, particularly with regard to your areas of expertise, Tony.
Thanks, Jess. And it's so great to see you. I wish you were around all the time.
Thank you.
For now, we're beginning to experience the immediate policy changes that President Biden has made in his very first few days in office, ranging from student loan relief to suspension of construction on the border wall. Those are the dramatic domestic items, but somewhat less noticed, but equally important, I would say perhaps more important, are the signals that he's been making to allies and to all nations that the United States will maintain its international legal obligations and to expand international cooperation. In law school, we learned a cardinal Latin phrase, pacta sunt servanda, which means agreements must be kept, agreements must be honored. It will take a great deal of patience and even more effort for the Biden administration to regain the confidence in the world, by the world, that in fact, the United States will honor its commitments once again. given our political volatility, we may expect his statements and even his actions to be met by skepticism abroad. After all, I mean, the world will see that another Trump-like administration could again hold office. Nevertheless, we can begin to rebuild international confidence by some immediate steps. First, and my order may be out of order, but the president has already moved to rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change. Now that's an executive agreement that requires no Senate confirmation. Second, we probably should, we should and probably will re-sign the Iran nuclear agreement and work separately to strengthen and especially to extend its duration. And ongoing negotiations, I'd like to point out, among countries that have kind of dicey relationships themselves have a very calming effect on troubled relations and concern. So the very process of negotiation, the very process of dialogue is very important. So far, the president has urged Russia to renew the INF, and we should also urge Russia to renew an agreement that perhaps none of you have heard about, the Open Skies Agreement, which dates back to the 1950s, with Russia, who will have withdrawn as of January 21st of this year without a strong effort on our part. There are many other areas of possible agreement that will open up once we demonstrate that we're willing and able to negotiate in good faith. And while the obstacle of treaty ratification continues to loom large, a 2/3 vote is not very likely on security matters in a 50-50 Senate. There are other avenues to pursue. Some economic treaties may secure the necessary heavy supermajorities. I mentioned executive agreements like the Iran nuclear deal that only require a presidential signature. Then there are congressional executive agreements that can be passed with simple majorities of both houses. So with determination and imagination, the United States can, I think, very quickly become again a major cooperative international partner. And I'll stop there and answer any questions on any treaty within my capacity to answer. Thank you.
Just on the issue of the open skies, we have a question that was raised. If Russia pulls out of the open skies, what is there to revive?
I suppose we can ask them to rejoin, just in the same way that we are asking ourselves to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal.
Okay. Okay, let me move to Tom Dannenbaum. How do you view the prospects or and what are the expectations from your point of view from the Biden administration?
Thanks, Jess. So let me say a few words about international criminal law and then some about international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict. And also in that context, think also about complicity, particularly in the Yemen war. So in the context of international criminal law, the key pressing issue is, of course, the sanctions that the Trump administration imposed on the chief prosecutor and a leading aide in September. And that followed an Executive Order 13928 in June, which authorized those sanctions. Those have been widely decried, including by key ICC critics, as morally misguided, fundamentally counterproductive on a number of dimensions, and also possibly unlawful. And so I think it's very likely that the Biden administration will reverse those sanctions fairly swiftly. But I think the deeper question in the context of international criminal law is beyond that ratcheting back of the most overtly hostile rhetoric and action of the Trump administration vis-a-vis international criminal law and the ICC in particular. What will the Biden administration's posture on international criminal justice be more broadly? And there, I think we shouldn't expect, or I think it would be inaccurate to expect, although I think normatively it would be desirable, the Biden administration to engage significantly with the International Criminal Court, even in the nuanced way that the Obama administration had, for the simple reason that there are now investigations ongoing with respect to US actions, specifically in Afghanistan, and also the prospect of an investigation in Palestine. And for those reasons, I think it's very unlikely that the Biden administration will engage in significant cooperation with the ICC outside of those areas. It's obvious that they won't engage in cooperation with respect to those investigations. I think it's also very unlikely that the Biden administration will address the root cause of those investigations, which is the fact of impunity for a torture regime that was authorized at the very highest levels of the Bush administration. We have clear precedent from the Obama administration on how the Obama administration approached that, which was basically to try and leave it behind. And I don't see any reason to expect that the Biden administration to reopen those investigations, although there have been calls for it, and I think it would be entirely appropriate. There are separate issues, incidentally, on that front with respect to some possible command responsibility issues with respect to Trump's pardon of war criminals, specifically Blackwater actors and others, Eddie Gallagher, earlier in his administration, which would be interesting issues from a perspective of international criminal justice, but I think it's very unlikely that the Biden administration would pursue them. Where I think we might see some more engagement on international criminal justice is outside the ICC, with specifically supporting hybrid courts, maybe supporting and engaging with the various investigative mechanisms, specifically the LL.M for Syria and the LL.M for Myanmar, and supporting the pursuit of international criminal justice in those more controlled, specific and focused environments in ways that are unlikely to threaten the United States. But there's, of course, a credibility issue when one takes a resisting posture to the ICC and then seeks to engage with international criminal justice in other domains. And so the question is, what credibility will the administration have there? With respect to the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law, there are a number of issues, and some of them really derive from the question of the scope of armed conflict, geographically and temporally. It's often described as a forever war, the war we're in, or forever wars, rooting back to the 2001 authorization for the use of military force in response to the attacks of 9/11, which has now underpinned US force across a wide range of states and contexts, a wide range of actors, many of which had no relationship to that original attack, but have been described as successor entities or co-belligerent or associated forces with Al-Qaeda. And so these ways in which that authorization for the use of military force and also the 2002 authorization for the use of military force against Iraq have been expanded. Biden and Blinken have indicated that they want to repeal and replace those authorizations for the use of military force. But the key question is, first of all, is there congressional will to craft a new one? And secondly, what does it look like? And in particular, what does it look like with respect to the way that it limits the scope of armed conflict geographically and temporally, and particularly the scope of the use of lethal force outside of areas of active hostilities? On that particular question, the targeted killing question, I think it's reasonable to expect that the Biden administration will probably revert to the Obama policy guidance on that issue, which in theory, on paper, was more or less in line with human rights standards for the use of lethal force outside of armed conflict. But in practice, many would say that it was not. In other words, there was dissonance between the expression on the page and the reality on the ground. And therefore reverse the deviation from those standards that occurred under the Trump administration, although we don't have this clear view of exactly what the Trump administration policies on that were, because they weren't released in the same way. So in other words, I think we'll see an increase in transparency or reversion to the Obama policies, but not a fundamental grappling with the readiness with which the United States resorts to lethal force outside of areas of active hostilities. So I'm relatively pessimistic about the degree to which that's actually going to be curtailed in any significant way. There's then a separate and related issue with respect to forever war questions around the closure of Guantanamo. That was obviously a flagship priority for Obama. He didn't get it done. Trump threatened to load up Guantanamo with bad dudes. Didn't do that. So we have 40 individuals currently held in Guantanamo. And the question is, does Biden have the will to devote the resources and attention that would be needed to close it, particularly in the likely face of congressional non-cooperation, which was, of course, the main obstacle that Obama faced on that front. There have been some interesting proposals that would indicate paths forward there, but it's really a question of attention and resources. And with the kind of ambitious agenda that this administration has, I think it's a difficult lift.
What would it take? What kind of a vote would it take in Congress to close it?
Well, the current problem is
that they have both houses. The Democrats have both houses. Aren't prospects better for a closure?
Well, in theory, they're better, but of course, what Obama found was that there was bipartisan opposition to bringing Guantanamo detainees to the United States for any reason, even for medical care, and that there was resistance, therefore, to some of the fundamental predicate conditions of closing Guantanamo. There are ways of doing it without transferring persons to the United States and without, therefore, needing to resort to congressional approval, and that would, in the first instance, mean engaging much more actively, and the Trump administration basically shut this down, in negotiating with other states for the release and transfer of detainees, engaging in plea bargains with those who are currently undergoing criminal prosecution, which is the minority of detainees at Guantanamo, and possibly not resisting habeas proceedings, which would allow for transfer absent other kinds of approval, because it would be pursuant to court order. And so there are ways in which you can do it without congressional approval. It's clearly more possible now, and there's also probably more fatigue with detention at Guantanamo, but it's also not a high profile issue in the way that it was under Obama. And so that cuts both ways, I think. And then the final thing I just want to say before handing it off is on the issue of complicity in armed conflict. One of the armed conflicts in which violations have been most widespread and deepest and most severe is the conflict in Yemen. And those violations have been perpetrated by both sides, but that includes the Saudi-led coalition, which has received enormous support from the United States, the United Kingdom, and others. And a key question is, what is the Biden administration going to do about US complicity in those violations? Biden and Blinken and others in the incoming administration have indicated that it's time to cease support for the Saudi-led coalition in the war in Yemen. But what exactly does that mean? What kinds of support are ended? To what extent? Simply by executive action, or is there going to be a push to change some of the legislative framework around the arms trade and around the degree to which the United States might end up being complicit in serious violations of international humanitarian law? I'm happy to go into that into more detail, but I'm conscious of the time, so I don't want to elaborate too much. But I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done in that specific space around complicity in those violations and the US arms trade. And the Trump administration, even though the Obama administration had also been involved in that arms trade, the Trump administration obviously escalated it significantly, reduced the policy constraints on it, and circumvented some of the legislative constraints on it, including by vetoing congressional efforts to block sales to Saudi Arabia. And so there are some areas for Biden and Blinken and others to work there.
Thanks. Tony, did I see your hand raised? Did you have a comment?
No, not yet.
Not yet. All right, wait. Okay, let's move on to Mike. Mike Glennon, looking at the tasks of the Biden administration, and what are the expectations that we should have, or maybe just what you have.
Well, thank you, Jess. I've already spoken, so I'm going to make only three very quick, brief points. First, President Biden has said that his foreign policy will place the United States back at the head of the table. I don't think that's possible. Our allies realize full well what happened over the last 4 years could always happen again. What happened at the Capitol this month reminded everybody of that. We should be grateful to have a seat at the table. Forget sitting at the head of the table. It was no accident that in Biden's inaugural address, which I thought was superb, by the way, he said almost nothing about foreign policy. He's promised a summit of democracies this year aimed at shoring up democratic governments around the world. And I can only say it's hard to think of any idea or proposal that's more timely for the United States. Second, it's true that Biden can do some things like that without Senate approval, such as, in addition, making non-binding political commitments like the Paris Accords or the Iran nuclear deal. It's also true, of course, that the Democrats now control the Senate. But here's the thing, and it's extremely important. In 2022, only 10 Republican senators are going to be up for re-election. 21 Democratic senators will be up for re-election at the same time. If the Democrats lose one of those seats, they lose control of the Senate. The practical effect of this razor-thin margin is that the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, will almost certainly follow the strategy of Mitch McConnell and all recent majority leaders and protect his senators from having to cast votes that will imperil their chances for re-election. In concrete terms, that means no controversial legislation, and no controversial treaties, no comprehensive test ban treaty, no International Court of Justice, no Rome Statute, no legislation, for example, carrying out the ICJ's order in the Avena case to review the death penalties that were imposed in part because of violations of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations by the United States in the Medellin case. No thought of rejoining the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. Probably, and I say this with great regret, probably no revisions of the AUMFs of the sort that Tom described, let alone a comprehensive revision of the War Powers Resolution, which would in addition, of course, require dealing with new technologies that have emerged since 1973, such as cyber and drones. All in all, a much shorter legislative agenda than Biden's supporters are hoping for, unless the Senate leadership assumes that the Democrats will have only 2 years in power in the Senate and go for broke. And I cannot believe that that is likely. Third, by some estimates, the United States has already spent nearly $4 trillion this year fighting COVID. Security guarantees cost money. The federal government is broke. For that reason alone, I cannot imagine the Biden administration making the sorts of promiscuous security commitments that have characterized American foreign policy over the last half century. It is unthinkable to me, for example, that Biden would, as Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, has urged, reinstate the security guarantee to Taiwan. That's not going to happen. I'll just conclude by saying this. I expect a much more modest American role in the world. This is what Biden recommended in the 1992 speech that I referred to earlier. Here's what he said, quote, "To realize the full potential of collective security, we must divest ourselves of the vainglorious dream of Pax Americana and look instead for a means to regularize swift, multinational decision and response." That was right in 1992, and in my judgment, that is right today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I want to move on to Ian Johnstone for your thoughts on our topic.
Thank you, Jess. In the interest of time, I'm going to be commenting on two areas of law: nuclear non-proliferation and global health law. And in the interest of time, I'm going to state what my expectations are without explaining them first, and then look at how much time I've used. And if I have time, I'll come back to explain one or two. And if not, we'll wait for questions and answers. So in nuclear non-proliferation law, the non-proliferation regime is really fraying right now, and it's not unlike it was when Obama took over. And like Obama, I think President Biden, the administration, is going to work hard to try to shore up that regime. And a couple of steps approximately in chronological order that I expect with varying degrees of certainty. First of all, they will extend the New START treaty for 5 years, the Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty with Russia. I'm confident about that because President Biden said he would yesterday, and Russia has already agreed to that. Second, I believe the administration will rejoin the Iran nuclear deal as long as Iran comes back into compliance, and they'll rejoin it on the original terms. They won't seek to renegotiate the timelines or add other issues like missiles as a condition for rejoining. They'll rejoin as it is and perhaps work on those other issues subsequently. Third, I believe they will and certainly should take some steps to set the stage for a successful NPT review conference. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has review conferences every 5 years. Some of those have been dismal failures. Some of them have been successes. There were successes in 2000 and 2010. There were failures in 2005 and 2015. There was meant to be a review conference in 2020. That did not happen, perhaps thankfully because of COVID. It's now scheduled to take place in August of this year. And there are a few things that I think the administration can, should, and probably will do in order to set the stage for a successful conference. First of all, commit to abiding by the testing moratorium, not joining or ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but voluntarily abiding by the moratorium. Secondly, and this is one that I'm not so confident about, declare nuclear no first use policy. Biden has come close to saying that, but not quite said that. I think he probably should. I'm not 100% sure that he will. And third, send some signals that address the concerns of the 51 countries who have now ratified the brand new, spanking new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which actually came into force today, exactly 90 days after the 50th country ratified it, which was in October. That I'll talk a little more about that treaty in a moment, but I think it's important. Obviously, the U.S. is not going to sign it, but I think it's important to register that the U.S. acknowledges the concerns of those who did sign it, which relate to disarmament by the nuclear weapon states. And then fourth, again, to set the stage, I would suggest holding a summit of the UN Security Council in order to address collectively issues around nuclear non-proliferation. Okay, there's some more long-term steps that I would suggest, but let me sort of skip over those for the moment and offer a couple of comments on global health law. There's going to be pressure to reform the World Health Organization and to revise the international health regulations. I don't expect anything dramatic out of the Biden administration. I certainly don't expect the administration to support giving the World Health Organization supranational powers to impose sanctions or anything like that. But I think a few more modest steps are likely. First, obviously, recommit to the World Health Organization, including by restoring funding. I would argue for even increasing the funding, both assessed and voluntary contributions, but I'm not sure that the administration will do that. And secondly, a number of modest revisions to the international health regulations. First of all, enhance the capacity of the World Health Organization to independently assess infectious disease outbreaks. Right now, the World Health Organization is very limited in its ability to do that, and there are some steps that could be taken which would strengthen that incrementally, but in significant ways. Second, bolster the mechanism for monitoring the compliance of states with their obligation to develop the core capacity in their health systems to prevent and detect infectious disease outbreaks. This is a binding legal obligation. countries were meant to have built that capacity by the year 2012. As of today, only 30% had that capacity. And so much more needs to be done in order to build that. And it can be done through some modest revisions in the international health regulations. And then finally, put in place a system for generating more resources needed to build resilient and equitable healthcare systems around the world. I believe this is both a requirement under the international health regulations and possibly also the human right to health. So those are some of my expectations, some with a degree of certainty, some less so. I believe I've used about 5 minutes, so I'll probably stop there and happy to answer questions about any of that.
I think there may be questions from the audience, but let's go to later. But let's go to Joel. Your expectations.
Thank you, Jess. I want to start by saying that, Donald Trump spoke of America first, and many liberal internationalists said that that would mean America alone. And indeed, in many ways it did. And I think that Joe Biden will be more cooperative with allies. And to the extent, and I recognize what Mike said about the United States' ability to be at the head of the table, and I take that to mean something about the United States' ability to be a kind of hegemon and take unilateral action that others follow. But I think leadership of the kind Joe Biden may anticipate might be different. And it occurs to me that international law is a leading tool of cooperation. And by leading in the formulation of international law, especially in some of the areas that I'll speak about, the United States might be able to lead again. So I think that's important. And it's important in the area that I'll address of trade to recognize that it's inextricably linked with domestic economic policy. So let me say 2 words about Biden's history in trade. Most recently as vice president, working for President Obama, he championed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the United States did not enter and which became the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it may be that the United States looks at that again. There are some areas of criticism, some areas that might need to be changed if the United States were to enter it. As senator, Senator Biden voted for the North American Free Trade Agreement, and he voted for China's entry into the World Trade Organization, but he voted against a free trade agreement with Peru because of concerns about labor and environmental provisions, which have now been addressed in some recent provisions of the revision of NAFTA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, as it's called. And Catherine Tai, the nominee for United States Trade Representative, was involved in those provisions and admires those provisions, interestingly. And so it may be that that's the model for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other trade agreements like that. I should say that here in this area of trade, at least Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor nominated by President Biden, has a more progressive kind of view. He authored a report that argued that globalization has increased inequality, has accelerated deindustrialization, and has failed to boost United States productivity. Looking back on the results of the Trump trade policy, which imposed high tariffs on many goods from China and steel and aluminum from other countries, we might say that liberal trade really does help investment and growth and manufacturing. And in fact, a leading trade economist, Danny Roderick, has noted that trade is only weakly implicated in deindustrialization and economic inequality. Now, one question about President Biden is whether he'll lift these massive tariffs on Chinese goods. And it's interesting that he hasn't done that. And that keeps the United States, in my judgment, in breach of international law. The WTO law on that is clear. I hope, so this is moving to expectations just in the form of my personal hopes, I hope that he will remove those tariffs quickly for the good of the international legal system, but more directly for the good of the United States economy. So there would be some easy wins for President Biden if he stops the self-harming tariffs under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, and the steel and aluminum purported national security tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Act of 1962. I think Biden plans to confront China on some of its intellectual property and subsidies policies by working with allies. The European Union has signaled it's ready to do that. Japan is ready to do that. And I think that that will be a basis for seeking actual reforms instead of, tweetable sales, which, by the way, those sales that were negotiated in the phase one deal with China have not been met. China has only purchased about 60% of what it undertook to do. I think that Biden should consider, and I think he will consider, re-entering the Trans-Pacific Partnership for both geopolitical reasons, working with allies in Asia, and also for economic reasons, because by not having these free trade agreements, we disadvantage United States exports because other competing countries have zero tariff access to other markets. There will be new challenges. The world has changed since the North American Free Trade Agreement and even since the original WTO in 1995. New challenges include current populist scapegoating of trade from the left and from the right, difficult issues of cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, robotics that raise questions about whether it's safe to import certain kinds of goods and services from other countries. The recession itself, due to the pandemic, will cause many countries to engage in massive subsidies to try to recover, and that will raise questions. Climate change is right there on Biden's agenda. The European Union wants to start imposing carbon taxes, wants the United States to impose carbon taxes too. In order to have carbon taxes, you'll want to have border tax adjustments for imports and exports. That will raise important trade issues. There are digital services taxes that a number of European and other countries have begun to impose, and that raises some trade concerns. There's a whole area of tax policy and international tax coordination that will be important. So just very briefly to conclude, I hope that Biden will be open to more multilateral free trade. This fragmentation of the world into local free trade agreements has been confusing, has been costly for business, and it would be better to go back to the multilateral system and negotiate tariff reductions. I think that in order to liberalize and trade further, we've seen this populist backlash, and one response is a true social safety net. I don't think that's on Biden's agenda. And it may be impossible, but it's necessary for further liberalization. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. I wonder if any of the panelists have questions or thoughts about what they've heard from their fellow panelists over the last 15 or 20 minutes.
I just wanted to say
Tom.
one thing about the JCPOA, which Tony raised. I think she's absolutely right to say that one of the key challenges the Biden administration faces is the deterioration of trust, the deterioration of confidence that this is actually a country that will keep to its agreements. And it seems to me that perhaps the deterioration of that confidence is likely to be nowhere greater than in the case of Iran. And so the challenge of renegotiating that, obviously there are interest-based reasons why Iran would want the US to be back in that agreement, but there's also surely particularly grave deterioration of trust there, even more so than before the agreement. And so I think that complicates not just the question of how to renegotiate the agreement, but also the degree to which the agreement will be taken seriously by Iran as a partner in that agreement, with the understanding on their part that it's quite plausible that we would face a reversion to a Trumpist type approach not that far in the future. And so I'm curious to hear either Tony or others' thoughts about what that means for the prospects of that particular project.
Ian?
I'm gonna add and complicate this for Tony, and then she can jump in. The other issue here is that Iran has presidential elections coming up in June of this year, and the hardliners are in the ascendancy, and it's very possible that Rouhani will be replaced by a more hardline president, and that's partly why I say that the Biden administration should and probably will rejoin now. Without trying to renegotiate, because it's only going to get harder and it's only going to get more difficult to negotiate in the future. But Tony, your thoughts?
No, I totally agree with that, Ian. I think moving quickly and not changing any of the provisions at the present time would be extremely important to try to accomplish. Thereafter, there are a number of different areas they're beyond this one area, including including some of the terrorist activities and so on that we may want to look at. But I think we've got to get this one in the bag and back to our full participation. Whether there'll be trust of the United States, I don't think so. I think it's going to take a long time beyond one term of this presidency to give the rest of the world confidence. But in that, we don't have to be head of the table. The world is not constituted that way anymore. I think a more modest role of participation in multilateral engagement is what we ought to be aiming at. And then where U.S. can lead, I think was well said in the formulation of international law, not in its execution.
There was a question that was raised in a more general sense. What can, from one of the members of the audience, what can the U.S. do to protect agreements that we make during the Biden administration from facing a repudiation if Trump #2 comes in afterwards? In other words, our politics is such that it introduces a instability in in the agreements that we make from administration to administration. So I wonder what you have. I think that's on the minds of many people in our audience. What can we do?
Well, I mean, the irony of an executive agreement is it's easy to accomplish and it's easy to erase. So I think there's an unsettled question of repudiating an advising consent, a full treaty. I think, as far as I know, that question has not been answered in any way that that gives anybody confidence in that answer. So what we can do, I think, is just to go ahead and to gain whatever support we can in Congress and to gain support in terms of the American people. And that can be shown in a number of informal ways. But I think there's no way to nail even a full treaty that's been established from reversal by another administration.
I think these are good points. It's possible for Congress to clarify the powers of the president to withdraw from trade and other treaties when they approve those treaties. And so far, Congress has left uncertain the authority of the president unilaterally to withdraw, at least from trade treaties.
All treaties.
And I think it's probably time to rethink that and to specify a mechanism. In the Uruguay Round Agreements Act, there's some unclear language that suggests that Congress would have to participate in removing its approval, but it doesn't say that Congress would have to participate in withdrawing. Jess, I think this is a fundamental problem for all international law, not just because of uncertainty about United States policy. We need the ability in international law, and I'm not sure how to solve that problem, to have longer term commitments. Just like in private contracting, we allow people to make longer term commitments in order to make some kinds of advances in international legal policy. It will be necessary to do that, and it's an area that we haven't solved yet.
Any thoughts, Ian?
Yeah, just another, back again to the Iran nuclear deal, but there may be some general lessons here with respect to security agreements. One of the things that the Obama administration did is take the Iran nuclear deal to the UN Security Council and have a Security Council resolution welcoming it. It didn't turn it into any more of a legal agreement than it was, but it sort of added the political weight of the Security Council, and in so doing makes it harder for one country to withdraw without there being significant political consequences. And I think we did see that with respect to the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal by the Trump administration.
Just two quick points on that. In answer to the initial question, the answer is simple. You want to prevent an agreement from being terminated, you enter into a binding international agreement, not a unilateral political statement that can be reversed by the next president. It's very simple. It's not simple to get there, however, because in many cases you need congressional or Senate approval. That's why the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris climate agreements were entered into as political undertakings rather than as binding agreements. Second, Joel is absolutely right. You could go back, presumably by statute, and designate a withdrawal procedure for given agreements or treaties.
Mhm.
And in fact, right after the President Carter terminated the Mutual Security Treaty with the Republic of China, Senate Foreign Relations Committee took up that project. Javits and Church asked the staff, and I was the person that they asked, to come up with a list of treaties that we should add a withdrawal procedure to so this can't happen again without congressional approval. And it turns out that there are all kinds of problems involved in that exercise, foremost among them being you set up a two-tiered system of treaties in which some treaty partners have privileged status and others don't. Boy, that creates all kinds of diplomatic headaches. So the committee ultimately dropped the project. However, Joel is right. There's no impediment to adding a ironclad congressional approval requirement for withdrawal, even retrospectively for something like the NATO treaty. And you could set up a category of agreements like mutual security treaties, for example, or arms control agreements, where you went back retrospectively and did that. Something that the Biden administration really ought to consider.
Other comments on that? One going back to the Iran deal, there was a question that said it's purported now that Iran is enriching uranium at the level of 20%, which exceeds the agreed upon level. how does that affect prospects or the Biden's prospects for a re-entry into that arrangement?
Yeah, well, so after the US withdrew, Iran first said, Europeans, bring them back into line, and then said, we will incrementally start exceeding the limits under the agreement. And it has done that. And the latest move was to begin enriching uranium to 20%. The agreement restricts it to doing so to 3.67%. 20% enriched uranium is enough to fuel a research reactor. It's still a long way from being weapons grade, which is around 90%. But what Iran has been doing is saying, until you come back into compliance, US, we're going to incrementally drift out of compliance. And obviously the US position has to be, we will rejoin the deal if you come back into compliance. So go back to the original terms. And Iran may, hopefully, probably will, but there's no guarantee of that. Yeah. They may well say, sorry, we're actually not so crazy about the agreement either. But certainly the US would have to insist going back to the original terms, which means no more 20% enrichment, no more advanced centrifuges, et cetera.
So there is a mechanism, but whereby each side can agree to continued U.S. participation or re-entry of the U.S. In a face-saving way. That is to say, we'll come in, but you've got to withdraw. But it was also agreed upon when Iran started to increase enrichment that if the U.S. came back, they might reverse the process. Is that? Yeah.
Yes. Iran has, there have been signals coming out of Iran, different sorts of signals from different groups within Iran, but I think the leading signals right now are they're prepared to do it. Go back to the original terms if the US quickly says we will rejoin the deal without trying to change the terms.
Okay. What are your expectations for immigration policy during the Obama administration? And I think that also includes the issue of refugees. Anybody have some thoughts on that? That was, again, another question coming from the audience.
Well, I think that President Biden is much more favorable in his views towards immigration than President Trump, and he's advanced legislation to reform United States immigration policy. I'm not sure what his policy will be on the global compact. I haven't seen anything about that, but I think we can expect a return to the earlier Obama approach to immigration and attempts to regularize those who are in the United States without authorization today, and to allow normal immigration and normal refugee entry into the United States.
Several of these questions have already been answered, including the issue of removal of sanctions on the individual members of the International Criminal Court. Do you see the Biden administration voicing human rights concerns or adopting a more pragmatic approach when it comes to its relations with the Indian executive? I think this is coming from the South Asia. What do you see about the Biden administration in using, well, I think this is a more general question, as part of his foreign policy, seeking to advance human rights concerns?
I think Blinken has been clear that human rights will play a more central role in the Biden administration than it did in Trump, which is not particularly surprising. I think it's plausible to think that the Biden administration would seek to rejoin the Human Rights Council and would seek generally to make human rights a more central component of its relations with states generally. I'm not sure exactly about the details of how they're thinking about relationship with India. That's not something I've looked into specifically. And so I think it will be a pragmatic approach more broadly. They'll invoke human rights, but I suspect they'll do it in a fairly pragmatic way. And so I think it will be a contextual determination of how strongly to bring those into discussions with the executive in India and in what precise ways, but others may have views on that specific bilateral relationship. I think it's clear that human rights will play a more central role generally, and that human rights institutions will be part of the strategy, but I'm not sure about India specifically.
Okay, good. Any other thoughts? We've come almost to the end of our allotted time for this this program. Any final thoughts, questions, dilemmas that you want to raise or leave with the audience as they, here we are, what, 2 days, 3 days into the Biden administration, but I think this was a very timely program to have dealing with all of these complex issues.
Well, it was good to see that Tony Fauci went to the World Health Organization, and that seems to be the main priority. In the area that I study, the World Trade Organization, the appellate body has been allowed to fall into disuse. There are no members left of it, and I think that President Biden will start allowing that. The Director General of the WTO needs to be appointed, and a Nigerian American candidate, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, is the consensus candidate, and I hope that President Biden will appoint her, even though former United States Trade Representative Lighthizer said she doesn't know about trade. I think she knows about international relations and knows enough and knows about development. So I think, we can see a return to earlier trends. And I think we have to focus on the question that Mike raised about the reliability of the United States in the future, and that relates to the stability of our politics.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, Tony?
One point is, I think stability and competence are showcased in all of the appointments here. And I know among many progressives, including my children, there's some disappointment that it's sort of the same old, same old. It looks like rerun of Obama administration in terms of appointments. I think people ought not to be disappointed. Progressives ought not to be disappointed, because we have been facing a vacuum of implementation, as well as a vacuum. And this is a group that can hit the ground running, as they say, and keep on running. And there's plenty of time for new faces and new ideas within the next few years, even before the end of the term. Yeah. So that's my note to progressives that are somewhat to the left of where I am.
Tom, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I wanted to add that I think, one of the biggest challenges is repopulating and regenerating the institutional confidence of the State Department. And so that's something that you can bring in the people at the top. I think Tony's right that bringing in people who have the experience and who have done this before makes some of the transition more straightforward. But there's this problem of the gutting of these institutions, in particular voluntary departures under the Trump administration, that needs to be addressed, and that I think will take a longer time to deal with, because people at the top need people on the ground to actually be implementing the changes that they're seeking to pursue. So I think that's a big challenge that the new administration faces, which of course means that Fletcher graduates are hopefully going to be in high demand.
One extension on that point about the quality of appointments. The new U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, who's, I don't know that much about her, but she's very well respected generally, and importantly, a veteran of the diplomatic corps. So I think it's wonderful that there's somebody who's got the experience, who's going to be representing the U.S. in the UN. And I think it'll be interesting to watch what happened in the UN Security Council, where the U.S. has its work cut out for it, managing relations with Russia and China and others.
You know, I don't think you should downplay the experience of Biden himself. When I think back on the preparedness of our new presidents, going back, I don't know, many terms, many administrations, I would say he is one of the most best prepared to enter into this morass he's got to deal with. Both not only his knowledge of our internal politics, but I also think his knowledge and connection with the leaders of other countries, particularly our allies, is a tremendous and valuable asset. I don't know how you feel about that, but certainly comparing him to others, going back, Obama, Bush, going way back, he stands out as, in my judgment, as one of the best prepared to take on these challenges. In any event, I want to thank the panelists. It's great to be back with you again. I really enjoyed this meeting, and I hope we can have others like it. I also want to thank all the members of the audience who participated. Thank you for your questions and for your attention, and I hope that you will all stay safe and well, and one day we can all get back on the campus of Fletcher School to have similar meetings. All the best to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, Jess.